Okay, so we're looking at a different concept than what we've been discussing so far, and this is called equilibrium and change. Okay, so if you remember from the populations lesson, when we said that an ecosystem was in a state of equilibrium, okay, we were talking about is specifically population numbers. So remember, equilibrium was when you had, let's say a graph of population, and then the population numbers kind of stayed the same. Okay, so this is like numbers, this was like time. Okay, so here we're talking about equilibrium, which is similar. It means that it's staying relatively constant, but here we're talking about an ecosystem equilibrium. So meaning that the biotic and abiotic things that are involved in that ecosystem. So this could be number of predators, number of prey, the amount of sunlight, the amount of water, the amount of shelter. They're staying constant over a certain amount of time. Now, we say relatively constant because, of course, things can change. You can have, let's say, predators increasing, or it rains a lot one spring session. Maybe there's a ton of rain that normally is there, so it changes up the features. But like over a long period of time, it stays about the same. So when do we establish equilibrium? So this is where you have your abiotic conditions maintaining relatively stable. So meaning there is enough nutrients in the soil, there's enough water, enough shelter, enough sunlight for the producers, everything is in balance. Okay, so what ends up happening is all of the living things get the required energy that they need. Nutrients are cycled properly through the food webs, and of course there is a balance between photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So when you have an equilibrium ecosystem, the populations are healthy and stable. So meaning typically when you have an ecosystem in equilibrium, the population is also in equilibrium. So meaning they're healthy. Of course, you naturally have organisms that will be born or that will die, but that's kind of the natural way of things. So meaning there's not a lot of disruption. So what we're going to talk about today is something called ecological succession. Okay, so this term succession means a gradual, predictable change that happens over a long period of time. Now, more specifically, the succession we're talking about is the composition of a community in an ecosystem and the abiotic conditions following a disturbance. Okay, so over here, when we're talking about equilibrium, right now there's no disturbance. Everything is kind of like in a natural balance. But when there is a disturbance, so meaning, let's say there is a forest fire, or there's a drought, or, a company comes here and cuts down all of the trees. That's a disturbance that is happening to that ecosystem. And what we're going to talk about is what happens to that ecosystem after the disturbance, after there's a drought, after the forest has been on fire. What happens then? So ecological succession is the process of establishing or replacing a community, and here's the key, following a disturbance. So a disturbance can be something that is natural, so like a geological event, let's say a tornado, or a drought, or an earthquake. Okay, something that is happening that's naturally, that can't really be changed, right? Like it's not humans that are causing it, it's a natural event. A forest fire, again, this can be natural, or this can be something that's been deliberately set, right? So obviously like a criminal activity, or human activity. So what we mean here is typically deforestation. So meaning if we were to cut down trees in a particular area, what happens once that disturbance is done? Okay, so there are two types of ecological succession. So essentially, it kind of depends on what the event is that is causing the disruption. We have primary succession, and then we have secondary succession, which we'll see in a bit. So primary succession is when you have an event that causes bare soil and rock to be exposed. Okay, and here's the key. No life previously is existing in that soil or in that rock. Okay, so here are some examples. There's not a ton of examples that will cause primary succession. So one could be, let's say there is a volcano that erupts and lava flows out of it and goes over an ecosystem, right? Lava, when it cools down, is essentially rock, right? So lava is like a liquid rock. So if there's a volcano and there's a huge, an eruption and the lava spills over the volcano and goes onto different ecosystems, the only thing you're going to be left behind with is rock. Now, the second scenario that is an example of succession in the primary sense is a glacier that is retreating. Okay, so if you know, and you may or may not know things about glaciers, let's see, I'm going to use black. And let's say this is water. Okay, so glaciers typically, even though a lot of glaciers are in water, so let's say this is water, and then this guy here is soil. Okay, and then this up here is the glacier. Okay, so glaciers typically are seen in water, okay, but a lot of glaciers, and actually hundreds and hundreds of years ago, there was more glaciers on soil. So of course, we're talking about areas north of us, right? So this would be, let's say in northern Alberta, British Columbia, Alaska. There's a lot of different glacier formations that are on top of land. So over time, as the glacier melts, okay, and just naturally over time, the glacier starts to recede. So let's say it used to be this large, and then now it's at this point, right? So there's now open land. Maybe here at this point, well, maybe another couple of 100 years go by. Let me move my glacier label. But a couple of 100 years go by, and now the glacier has retreated even more. Okay, well, what you're left with right here is bare soil. This soil previously had nothing living in it. It's not like when the glacier moved back, there was grass and, insects and grasshoppers and earthworms. Like, there was nothing here. You have to imagine, this was essentially permafrost. There was nothing here. But as the glacier recedes, this soil is now open and bare. So there's no life there. So you have to imagine this is like our newly exposed soil. So what we're talking about with primary succession is what happens when you have rock or soil that doesn't have any life in it. What happens over time? Okay, so first of all, we'll mention that this is a very slow process. You have to imagine there is nothing here currently. But over hundreds and hundreds of years, eventually you will have a forest community again. So what happens first? The beginning part of succession always starts with small producers. Okay, so it's not like all of a sudden after 10 years we're going to have like a huge oak tree here. So we start with lichens, okay, or moss. So little tiny producers that can start to live on rock. It almost can sometimes look like a mold, okay, but they're little tiny producers. So over time, the producers begin to grow, and what happens is nutrients begin to, of course, when these producers die, there's going to become decomposition, and you're going to have bacteria that will begin the decomposition process. So then you'll have smaller plants coming in. So obviously not, moss. Then you have smaller plants, then a little bit of larger plants, maybe some grass now. And then eventually you'll have larger and larger producers coming into play. Now, the first species that are there, so this first beginning point of time, like imagine though, the point from here to here could literally be 1,000 years. Okay, this is a long process. But this will happen. Naturally, life will find a way. So they're known as the pioneer species. So they're like the first ones to arrive. Then, pardon me, you start having grass, shrubs, small trees, right, known as intermediate species. And the climax community here is essentially now where you have larger trees and you have a full, essentially, forest community. Now, notice we're only talking about producers here, but the same thing happens with other living organisms. So at the beginning, if you can imagine, the first living things that would be here will most likely be bacteria. Then over time, maybe you start having insects, or you start having small little rodents that eat the grass. Like once you start having food available for living things will naturally migrate there because there's an abundance of resources, of food. So, of course, and then you get the larger organisms, you're going to have larger living things there as well. So there's more food for them. So you start having, and of course, imagine here, if let's say rabbits and squirrels start coming in, well, different things that eat rabbits and squirrels will start making their way there as well, right? It's all about resources and how available they are. So then we have secondary succession. So secondary succession is much more common. Okay, so like I said, there's not really a lot of things that will cause primary to happen, right? Maybe a volcano, a glacier, right? In Canada, we don't really have volcanoes, but for sure we have glaciers in the northern part of some provinces. And then secondary succession is actually very common in that there's going to be a natural disruption that will cause the ecosystem to be disrupted. Now, the main difference between primary and secondary, primary has no life in this rock or soil. Secondary, this is something that has life that was there before the event, right? So imagine a forest fire, right? There were living things. This soil already has nutrients. It already has decomposers. There are already living things that are in this area. So the process is actually the same process. You have your pioneer species, intermediate, and climax community. The main difference is you now have life already here at the start. So this process is much quicker, right? You have to imagine if there's only bacteria here or there is no bacteria, it's going to take a long time for the climax community to be done. But because you already have an established soil system with lots of nutrients, this process becomes much quicker. Okay, so this can be a human event or it can be something natural. Let's say there's a tornado. A tornado goes through a forest and a whole bunch of trees get destroyed, right? It's not going to take long for that to replenish themselves. And by long, it's still going to take many, many, many years, but it's nowhere near the comparison for how long primary is going to take to do.